Hello friends, I'm the Jam Philosopher and welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking about some D&D lessons we can pull from one of my favorite shows, Rick and Morty. Now for those of you who don't know, Rick and Morty is basically a cartoon sci-fi adventure series that is based on the adventures of Rick Sanchez, who is basically this super intelligent but arguably psychotic and sociopathic scientist who has developed this interdimensional portal travel technology, which has sort of defined his existence. In the show, he moves back in with his family and develops a close friendship with his grandson, Morty. Morty is sort of a normal kid, not super smart, but not necessarily a dummy, as the show reveals as it goes on. But the two have grandpa-grandson adventures together. But these adventures are wild, zany sci-fi adventures that often utilize the portal travel technology, lead them on a lot of crazy adventures. It's also got a lot of really funny, cool sci-fi concepts, and there are actually some really cool storylines and even some dramatic and heavy, dark moments within the show. Personally, I believe it is a literary and television masterpiece, and so this is why it is one of my favorite shows of all time. But there are a lot of crucial lessons we can take from Rick and Morty to apply to our D&D games to make them even better. And in fact, in this video, I have 5 different really important but probably often misunderstood concepts that Rick and Morty uses all the time to make the show really cool, really fun, really engaging, and really metal, actually, that we can actually pluck directly from it and apply to our D&D games to accomplish a very similar thing. And you don't even have to be a professional animator to pull it off. You don't even have to be a sociopathic, dimension-hopping genius. Let's dive into tip number 1, and this is actually a really great example. Filling in pixels around the characters doesn't need to be portal science. In fact, it doesn't even need to be rocket science. It can actually even be closer to Morty science, if you get what I'm saying. Let me explain what I mean by this. I often describe being a game master as exactly this. You are filling in the pixels around the player characters to help them tell the story of their characters. There's a lot more to it than that, but we could really boil it all down to that as a basic conceptual premise, and I'm pretty happy with that. I feel pretty good with that description of being a game master. With that being said, it is this business of filling in the pixels that sometimes confounds us. Sometimes we try to get too complicated and we make it too confusing. Sometimes we try to prepare too much and then we bog ourselves down in details. But sometimes we just end up overthinking it so much that we create extra steps for ourselves and we interrupt our flow. Now, obviously, there are alternative contrasts to this. Some GMs do not prepare enough. Some GMs do not put enough effort into preparation, etc. However, I do tend to find that among people who want to be good GMs, over prep is generally the issue, and then the bogging down that happens more so than under prep. But Rick and Morty uses a surprisingly simple technique for dealing with this exact kind of issue that really stands as a technique that we game masters could actually adopt from the writers of the story into our own game prep. And that is this: placing a greater emphasis on the story and the importance of the individual pieces of it than on the overall complexity or even, dare I say, realisticness of the whole is always going to result in a bigger win for the player character narrative. Let me give you a specific example. Throughout the show Rick and Morty, there are a lot of references to things within the show that the names for which almost sound completely made up. Like, it's almost like the writers didn't even write it. It was just spoken into existence during an ad-lib recording session, and they just went with it. For example, in Season 1, Episode 7, Raising Gazorpazorp, Rick refers to a currency called smidgens while he's bartering at the pawn shop for a part. And the planet that the baby-making robot comes from, that Rick purchases at that pawn shop for Morty, is literally called Gazorpazorp. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think that this was a name that was run through a committee to try to make it super cool and immersive sounding for the sci-fi setting. I think that this was probably something that was thrown out by the creators and then run with almost like a joke. Gazorp almost sounds like a made-up place, which it is, but it literally sounds like a made-up place. In other words, there isn't a ton of emphasis placed on the name of the thing, but the show does go into detail about the culture and society of Gazorp as a world. And it turns out it's this male-dominated society where they really haven't had women for a long time, or so they think. It turns out to be a little bit different. And it turns out that they use these baby-making machines to proliferate because there are no more females, or so they think. That changes a little while later too, but anyway. The point is that the episode does a really good job of focusing on the society. It focuses on the characters. It focuses on the actual Gazorp Morty child that's created when Morty canoodles with the baby-making robot and then creates this war-loving savage that ends up not really working out living with Morty and the family. But the whole thing started with just what sounded like a throwaway phrase, Gazorp, which was a planet where this baby-making robot was made, which was purchased with a currency called smidgens, which sounds like another throwaway phrase. Rick and Morty does a great job of not taking the prep work too seriously. What they take really seriously is the value of the narrative, the value of the characters, and the value of the setting, at least the parts of it that really do matter to gameplay. And this is a really good lesson in filling in pixels. Sometimes as GMs, we really seriously overcomplicate things. We overplan things when sometimes it might be better to just throw some stuff out there, see what ends up being meaningful, and then focusing on the stuff that truly will matter, especially to the players and their narrative arc, and then making those things deep, and then those things become actually really awesome, sort of like those of us who love Rick and Morty refer back to the episode dealing with planet Gazorp as being actually pretty awesome, even though the name Gazorp literally sounds, again, kind of like a throwaway name without any context, without any contextual appreciation for the show and what type of show Rick and Morty is. So fun fact, really quick, did you know that there's actually a Rick and Morty versus Dungeons and Dragons tabletop role-playing game adventure? There actually is. You can play D&D through the lenses of the mad, narcissistic genius Rick Sanchez from the animated Cartoon Network series Rick and Morty, the Rick Way. It's basically a tabletop role-playing game box set that blends the world of D&D with Rick Sanchez's powers. This is just a wild thing. You can find a link to this down in my description on D&D versus Rick and Morty. This is available on Amazon, though at this point it's really more available as a collector item. There are a few different places you can purchase it. But anyway, yeah, grab that. Link is in the description if you're interested in actually putting the Rick and Morty universe and the D&D universe into one and the same game. Boom. Wild stuff. Anyway, that leads us to point number 2. Character depth and complexity can totally happen in very small doses over time. Rick and Morty is really interesting in the sense that you can watch an episode about interdimensional cable that doesn't really seem to have much to do with anything else. There's a bunch of random things going on that seem to just be funny to laugh at and kind of fun to watch. But then they will throw something in there that's actually very canonical and crucial to an overarching storyline. In a sense, there are a lot of episodes of Rick and Morty that can stand alone, but there are also Easter eggs in those episodes that tie themselves to larger plot arcs, and there are also entire episodes that are part of concurring plot arcs that run throughout the series. And at this point, as of the time that I'm filming this, there are 7 completed seasons of Rick and Morty. Season 8 is coming up pretty quick. Wubba lubba dub dub. With that being said, Rick and Morty does a fantastic job of not taking character depth and complexity too seriously in one hand, treating it with the fun, flippant, spur of the moment immersion that it deserves, while also really investing in it as a long-term investment to make it truly epic and actually really cool and deep. And we could take a lesson from this in our longer running D&D campaigns. Let's take for just a moment an example. let's discuss the character Rick Sanchez himself. He's incredibly smart, while deeply flawed. In fact, in season 1, episode 1, the pilot, the whole show starts off with Rick's character literally stumbling drunk into Morty's bedroom, trying to get him to come see something. He has a surprise for him. They end up getting in the spaceship. Rick tells Morty that he built the spaceship out of stuff in the garage. He's absolutely blitzed drunk. And then he tells Morty that he has a neutrino bomb in the back, and then he's going to blow up the world. They're going to kidnap Jessica, and Morty and Jessica are going to be the new Adam and Eve. Morty gets freaked out. I mean, this is within the first 3 minutes of the show, and he starts trying to take the wheel away from Rick. They end up kind of landing in the desert, and Rick passes out, and it ends up being just this wild intro to the show. At first glance, Rick appears to be a relatively disturbed, sociopathic narcissist who doesn't seem to care about anyone but himself. He has a lot of selfishness. He's incredibly intelligent, but he's also very destructive. It almost seems like he has this grand potential, but he just ruins that by being such a piece of garbage person, basically. He is tormented by these destructive demons that seem paired up as complements to his intellect. But over time, we also see that there's a lot more to Rick's character than this. For example, a bit further onward in season 1, in the episode Me Seeks and Destroy, also affectionately known as the Me Seeks episode, we see King Jellybean attempt to victimize Morty in the bathroom in the little medieval town, which ends up being one of the most diabolical, crazy, dark scenes in the whole show. Like, literally, King Jellybean tries to force himself on Morty in the bathroom, and it's such a jarring, crazy thing. We're going to talk about that more in just a second, that scene. There are a lot of literary tools being used in that scene, but anyway. The point is that we see Rick going from being this crazy, drunken, sociopathic old man, sort of in, episode 1, to in this episode with Mr. Jellybean, King Jellybean. We see that at the end of the episode, when Rick realizes why Morty is afraid of King Jellybean and like what's going on, we see this look, just this look of like anger, and it's actually really perfect. We see Rick realize what has happened between King Jellybean and Morty, and then right before Rick and Morty jump out and close the portal behind them, Rick's hand comes back through, he fires his gun and kills King Jellybean before they leave as an act of revenge, sort of like a, hey, this is what you get when you mess with my grandson. This is only one of many instances where Rick shows his love, care, and compassion for Morty. In fact, if we fast forward to season 1, episode 10, Close Encounters of the Rick Kind, you'll see a scene toward the end where Rick is literally crying while looking at memories of his grandson. And in the toxic Rick and Morty episode, he even references his irrational attachments, including his attachment to Morty, as something that's undeniably a part of him, but also something that he hates about himself, views as toxic, and sees as a personal flaw. The point here is that we get little glimpses of who Rick is in every episode. It's not given to us as a whole narrative arc, and never does the show make this huge attempt to push it all on us and make us understand it all in one big spoonful. But it is fed to us, trickled to us, as if through IV fluids very slowly throughout the whole show. And what is left is a very deep and complex character that is really exciting to watch and experience, even though we're really only teased with little bits of who Rick really is here and there. It's a sort of less is more approach in a way. And Rick is not the only character that the show expertly creates depth with in this sort of contrasting, small dose fashion. Jerry Smith is another character with a very deep and complex character arc that is really fed to us in tiny bits at a time and never really shoved on us in a whole dose. For example, Jerry Smith is Rick Sanchez's son-in-law. He's the husband of Beth, father of Morty and Summer. And there's this ongoing storyline between Rick and Jerry, which is basically like Jerry is this unliked son-in-law who can never live up to Rick's standards. Rick sees him as a bumbling idiot and a loser, whom Rick claims shot up his daughter with 20 cc's of liquid dream killer, and is basically a parasite predator that feeds on other people with his victimness and elicits pity from them so they'll feel sorry for him and not want to cast him out, treating him as the true loser he deserves to be. Rick really lays this all out to Jerry personally in no short form manner in the whirly-durly conspiracy episode. But anyway, the show starts out with Jerry sort of being apprehensive of Rick, not wanting him to overstep. Rick kind of starts to come between him and Beth in the marriage. Things start to get really tense. And then before you know it, spoiler alert, Jerry and Beth end up getting a divorce, which Rick is incredibly happy about. Rick sees no issue kicking Jerry out and replacing him as the de facto patriarch of the home. And it's just a whole storyline. It goes from kind of Jerry being this kind of seemingly happily married guy to Beth realizing they're not actually happily married, realizing they have big problems, trying to solve problems, failing to solve problems, getting divorced, feeling very sorry for himself, going through this character arc that involves him basically trying to learn not to be a pathetic parasite type character to actually becoming a character who at several points throughout the show shows a lot of kind of heroic merit of his own. For example, helping to save Beth during their botched alien relationship counseling adventure, which is one of the best episodes in the show. And there's even a version of Jerry that ends up becoming pretty awesome, kind of like a Tarzan-like figure in the original universe where Rick and Morty bounced after they created a bunch of Cronenbergs in the botched attempt to create a love potion that would make Jessica love Morty. Morty later on returns to this version and basically gets rejected by his Tarzan-like version of his father, who had become a pretty hard, capable, heroic character, if a bit savage, evil, and survivalistic. Anyway, the fact that the show leads us through the ups and downs of Jerry's character, while also giving us bite-sized segments to just enjoy in episodic format, is something that we can take away from the show as game masters as sort of a set of tools for primer on helping characters to build epic depth throughout the narrative. A lot of times, we as GMs can overthink the depth of character. We want these deep characters. We want to have deep NPCs. We want the player characters to experience depth. We want the players to feel like their characters have depth and meaning, and we tie in backstories and we put personal plot arcs into the mix. We do all these things. But sometimes we try to do too much at once, and sometimes our expectations are too big. Sometimes the best approach is to do just a tiny bit of character building in every episode and to let it factor up over time to a big thing. Watching season 1, episode 1 of Rick and Morty is not so different from watching season 7, episode 1 of Rick and Morty. You can still enjoy the episode as a whole, but those who have watched all of the show leading up to there will have a much different perception of Rick, Jerry, Morty, and everyone else than they would have if they hadn't watched the whole show because of all the backstory that's included in it. And that does make it special. That creates impact and immersion. And we could stand to take a few notes from this. In other words, don't try to cram a bunch of story into your session all at once. Run the session, make it a good session, put a little bit of story in there to deepen the character plot arc for each specific character. A little bit is going to go a long way. By the way, do you struggle to come up with plot arcs on the fly? If so, I have the perfect tool for you. It is called My Ultimate Plot Randomizer. It is a free ebook. When you join my email list, you can download this for free. You'll get the link in your first email. It contains 4 D100 tables that will let you roll random plot arcs whenever you need them. Roll the hook, the conflict, and the conclusion, and even add wild and wacky stuff all right there. Download this, print it out, add it to your tool collection, and you will never go without another plot arc again. I give this away for free to help you create awesome plot arcs just like I do. I use this in almost every single session, and you are not going to want to miss out on this, so make sure you grab this. Now let's take this a little deeper into a subnote. Let's blend this with tip number 1 for just a minute. This is actually important. Tip number 1 was filling in pixels around the characters doesn't need to be portal science. And tip number 2 is character depth and complexity can totally happen in small doses over time. Now let's take these and blend them together using one character in Rick and Morty that's actually really, really recognizable and fun, even though he doesn't appear very often, and that is Mr. Poopy Butthole. Okay, he makes his first appearance in season 2, episode 4, which is called Total Recall, where he helps the family to basically deal with this alien parasite infestation where they embed themselves into the brain and create a bunch of zany characters that then try to convince you that they are your friends so that they can escape into the world and infect other people. Mr. Poopy Butthole shows up, and at first he kind of seems like a zany character, but spoilers, he ends up actually being a family friend who apparently Rick has known for a long time and has a close relationship with. At the end of that episode, Beth even shoots him thinking he's a parasite, and then he almost dies, and they take him to the hospital, and it's a huge deal, and Beth feels very bad about it because her mind is playing tricks on her. She thought that he was a parasite and accidentally shot a long-term family friend. Now, this was a weird character. His name is Mr. Poopy Butthole. He kind of looks like a yellow bean character. He kind of looks like an ad-lib. It almost looks like, once again, one of those things where the writers, in speaking the dialogue into existence, just came up with him, and then it was just a funny idea and they ran with it. There wasn't much thought put into it. I mean, it just sounds like a throwaway ad-lib character. However, he also comes back a few more times in the show, most specifically in season 3, episode 8, in Morty's Mind Blowers, where he appears in throwbacks that have been deleted from Morty's past memories, and then again in season 4, episode 3, in the episode One Crew Over the Crew Cruise Morty, where he joins Rick and Morty for the heist episode. That's what it's more commonly referred to as, the heist episode. Anyway, so he's in this episode as well, and he is a crew in Rick's heisting crew. So what went from being just a simple throwing stuff out there, i.e. ad-libbing, i.e. Mr. Poopy Butthole, easy way to fill in some pixels around the characters, sort of like a Mr. Joe Smith with a top hat, it ends up actually being a pretty epic character because a little bit of depth is created here and there, and because people liked it. I don't know if the writers of Rick and Morty kept Mr. Poopy Butthole around because he was so well liked by the audience. It was probably more like he was just well liked by the writers. In any case, he stuck around, and even though he was zany and ridiculous, he had a place that actually became relatively legitimate within the show. It emerged that he was a professor at a university, he was a kung fu expert, and he had been on a lot of adventures with Rick. Anyway, the point here is pretty simple. Mr. Poopy Butthole is an example of like limited pixels, not going crazy over the pixels you put in there on the characters, sometimes just throwing stuff out there. And then the fact that he becomes a recurrent, relatively important character shows us that character depth can grow even from those limited pixels, and that investing in the things that really matter is a lesson that we can take away to take to our D&D games, because Mr. Poopy Butthole is one example of something that kind of looked like a throwaway ad-lib but actually became really important. And so therein lies the lesson, and therein lies a lesson about how we can create meaning in our games, and how meaning can often come from unforeseen, sometimes even quote-unquote throwaway places, characters, events that we didn't even plan to keep around necessarily. And this is going to take us to point number 3, which is continuity and immersion issues are minimized when you stay character, or in this case, player focused. Now, let me explain what this means. Rick and Morty definitely has a complicated continuity system that's super easy to self-correct due to the fact that there are basically unlimited timelines within which to do things. Rick and Morty does a lot of basically world jumping using a sort of string theory model as opposed to time travel, which makes it super easy to basically just jump timelines and correct things that are wrong, to fix mistakes, or to even leave mistakes completely behind, and it explains a lot of continuity issues that would otherwise plague the show. This is perhaps most viscerally pointed out in season 4, episode 8, the Vat of Acid episode. In this episode, Morty talks Rick into creating him a respawn device that will allow him to retry things over and over and basically create himself a save point in time. Little does Morty know, Rick thinks that this is a tacky idea and ends up building him a device that basically kind of does the same thing, but what ends up happening is every time Morty respawns himself, instead of hopping backwards in time and doing it over again, he's actually hopping to another timeline, eviscerating the Morty in that timeline, and then moving forward. So it's actually kind of metal and sadistic, but it's all just part of the story, and this is a real visceral description of how in the story the timeline hopping mechanism works. And of course, Rick and Morty exist across all timelines for the most part, so at least all of the timelines within the central finite curve. Anyway, Personally, I see this episode as creating one of the more problematic plot holes within Rick and Morty's universe. If you'll indulge my Rick and Morty nerdiness for just a second, in season 1, episode 6, Rick Potion number 9, Rick specifically says that there are only so many chances to get a complete do-over with a jump to another reality. This was said in the context of Rick and Morty creating a whole planet of Cronenbergs and then bouncing on that to find a new reality where they had died and also solved the problem, because there are basically unlimited timelines. But as Rick puts it, the circumstances allowing for a non-problematic jump and basically continued context without a whole lot of change makes it sort of a difficult thing to find all the time. This begs the question, why not create an autosave for himself, right? Using the technology he used to make Morty's reset button device. This could lead to him being sort of invulnerable in the sense that no matter what happened, he would just hop to a parallel timeline and he'd be fine. I think that Rick would say the reason he didn't do this was because this could lead to him being vulnerable to truly intelligent and formidable foes like Rick Prime or Evil Morty. He would also probably call this hacky and predictable, so that shows what I know. But anyway, the idea here and the application for D&D is this. Despite the sometimes confusing nature of the continuity situation within Rick and Morty, despite the fact that sometimes it doesn't necessarily make sense, and despite the fact that sometimes it almost seems problematic and that there are elements of it that are difficult to explain, the show works and the context works because it stays player focused, or in this case, character focused. And as GMs, when we stay player and character focused, continuity issues, immersion issues, they will only matter so much. If the whole purpose of the show was to show us the universe system and the up close parameters of how portal travel works, then yeah, this might be kind of an issue. A little bit of continuity problem, a little bit of immersion relating to this technology might actually really hurt the show. It might kind of ruin it for us. It might be frustrating, as it is when I see continuity errors in shows that I really otherwise like. But as a viewer, I can honestly say that none of this matters to me with Rick and Morty, because really they do a good enough job in like the first and second degrees of keeping continuity errors like away from the premise, making it make sense, that it doesn't bother me, it doesn't really matter, and I don't read too deeply into it, because what I'm really watching the show for is the story of Rick and Morty and Jerry and Beth and Summer, etc. So staying player focused, staying character focused is something that we can take from this as GMs. When we make the characters the focus of the narrative, and trust me, the players care about the characters. They care way more about the characters and their stories than the specific minute details of your campaign setting and any continuity errors that may exist. Even if you end up with a few continuity errors that you may need to kind of self-correct with a little magic or with a little shenanigans, this is not going to be nearly as big a deal as if you take the focus off of the characters and put it on your world instead of on the characters. When we keep that focus on the characters, the story stays fun, it stays interesting, it stays a narrative that we want to invest in, that we really care about. And anyway, that's going to lead us to point number 4, long-term investment into plot arcs and setting those plot arcs up for your characters is incredibly beneficial, even if you don't push it and even if they move super slowly. Let me explain what I mean by this. Now, be careful. I'm about to say some major spoilers for Rick and Morty, so you may want to close your ears or not listen to this part super closely, or try to forget it. If you do, maybe, brainalize yourself with one of those Men in Black devices after watching this so that you don't remember what I'm about to say. But this is a huge spoiler for the show. However, let's take Rick's long-term plot arc pursuing Rick Prime as an example here. And once again, I'm trying to explain how in D&D, long-term investment into plot arcs is incredibly beneficial, and you don't have to push it hard, and you don't have to worry about moving it fast. A little bit of investment into important plot arcs goes a long, long way. Rick Prime first shows up in the Rick and Morty series in season 3, episode 1, Rick Shank Redemption. This is also known as the Shoney's episode, the episode where the aliens have captured Rick and they're trying to probe his mind to discover the origins of portal travel. Basically, how Rick invented portal travel. They would like to have this tech for themselves, but that's what they're going back to. And for those of you who don't know, well, you probably shouldn't be listening to this. For those of you who need a refresher, who have watched Rick and Morty before, Rick Prime is basically the first Rick to discover portal travel. He tried to give it to Rick C-137, who is the Rick we follow in the show. Rick C-137 basically said, no, I don't want it. I'm done with this science stuff. I'm gonna choose my family. This made Rick Prime kind of be like, okay, bud, whatever. I don't know if it made him angry or, to me, it's a little unclear as to his motives why. Probably because he needed it to work. But he basically ended up dropping a bomb, blowing up Rick C-137's life and taking out his family in the process. Well, taking out his wife, who then, because of that, wasn't able to give him the family that he has in the current day. Fun fact, the Morty C-137 is actually Rick Prime's Morty, which is really interesting. But anyway, from that point on, the Rick Prime plot arc is only revisited a few times throughout the series. There are whole spans of the series where it's not even revisited at all. And a lot of people call this Rick's origin story. It's like not even discussed. There are nearly entire seasons of the show that go by without revisiting this. However, it starts to come to a head around season 6, episode 10, in the Rictional Mortpoon's Rickmas Mortcation episode. In this episode, Morty gets a lightsaber for Christmas and ends up kind of accidentally discovering that the Rick he's lately been adventuring with is a cybernetic, like robot Rick programmed by the actual Rick. Actual Rick is living in his basement, basically going into a deep dive obsession trying to find Rick Prime, and Morty discovers him as the lightsaber is going downwards. Like he drops the lightsaber perfectly vertically and is going down. He's trying to catch it. So he's going down layers trying to get the lightsaber. And he runs into Rick, realizes Rick has been lying to him, and is actually chasing Rick Prime, even though he didn't tell Morty about it. Didn't want to drag Morty into his darkness. Anyway, and that leads us on kind of the beginning of the end of the arc of Rick C-137 finally hunting down at Rick Prime and having his final epic battle with him, where Evil Morty also joins in, and they kind of tag team him because Evil Morty wants the big Omega weapon, etc. The point here is that this plot arc is super epic. This plot arc is so integral to the value of the show of Rick and Morty. It is Rick's origin story, and every time it comes back in, you're on the edge of your seat being like, oh my God, this is another part of the story. But you go vast swaths of time without ever seeing anything about it. And that does not ruin the show. See, as D&D GMs, sometimes we want to put those little bitty ingredients into our plots, like into our story ideas, into the big bad, the big overarching world situation. We want to plant little pieces of that into the gameplay, but what we don't want to do is shove a bunch of it on the players all the time. We just breadcrumb it a little bit. We have little episodes where we introduce that back in, and that builds so much anticipation, and then the players can sandbox it away from there. Like, it doesn't matter. That doesn't take away from the main plot line. So again, I'm just going to rephrase it. Long-term investment into plot arcs and setting those plot arcs up for your characters is incredibly beneficial, and you don't have to push it, and you don't have to go fast. You can take it very slowly, and it can still be incredibly effective. And that's going to lead us to our final point. But quick before we jump into our final point, I just want to point out that if you're interested in playing like any kind of like sci-fi sort of space adventure type thing using D&D 5e, then what you really need is the Spelljammer game setting for D&D 5e. The Spelljammer Adventures in Space is a thrilling space-based campaign for the world's greatest role-playing game, home of the Star Wars and Gateway to the Heavens. The astral plane teems with excitement and possibility. With the help of magic, spelljammers can cross the oceans of wild space, ply the silvery voyage known as the Astral Sea, and hop between worlds of the D&D multiverse. And basically, this is a collection of 3 different books and some other cool items. Now, you'll find a link in my description to the Amazon listing for this. I'm an Amazon affiliate. If you want to purchase the Spelljammer D&D campaign setting, it comes with 3 awesome books and a bunch of other cool things, and you might want to run some sci-fi shenanigans in your D&D game. Well, guess what? If you click on that link in the description and you purchase that through Amazon, As a qualified affiliate, I will earn a very small commission on that purchase to help support the channel at no additional cost to you. This helps me to support the channel, helps me to keep creating awesome content about the greatest game in the world, D&D, and it equips you with the Spelljammer campaign setting. Whether you want to go full sci-fi or you want to keep it fantasy and space, this is the supplementation you need to actually make it work with a bunch of awesome like shipbuilding stuff and alien races that you might find out there and all that cool business. Anyway, make sure you click down in the link and check that out. You're not going to want to miss that. And all right, with that being said, let's jump back into the video. Now let's move on to our final point, which is this. Contrasting fun, comedy, wholesomeness, and goofiness with dark material, gritty, almost horrific stuff provides a contrast that can bring incredible depth to the narrative experience. Rick and Morty is a fun show. It's got silliness, it's got goofiness, and yeah, there are a few adult themes thrown in there, but for the most part, it's like made up of like fun little quips, funny, almost slapstick like humor, cool references. Like there's a lot of silliness, a lot of zany silliness, okay? There are also some dark moments in this show, okay? So for example, in season 2, episode 3, autoerotic assimilation, which everyone will probably know best as the Unity episode. Rick runs into a hive mind named Unity, who apparently he used to date. And him and Morty and Summer have this weird experience where Summer and Morty basically kind of get ditched as Rick returns to dating and doing shenanigans with Unity. And the planet that Unity is inhabited is completely a hive mind. There's a lot of different plot arcs that go on here, but the one that I want to focus on here is that this whole episode is kind of a funny situation going on between Rick and Unity, where they start kind of doing a bunch of illicit substances and Unity starts to fall apart. As it turns out, this collective planetary hive mind can't really keep up with partying with Rick Sanchez. There's also the fact that she has a big crush on him and he actually left her before, and so that was like a whole ordeal. There's a more serious element to this episode where Summer and Morty are kind of trying to get the people to revolt against the hive mind because they see being the hive mind as being like an infringement on personal freedom. And then it turns out that there's like some ups and downs to that. So that's like a bit of a more serious arc. But the arc between Rick Sanchez and Unity is sort of just a silly, funny, like kind of comedic type up and down situation until it starts to take a turn for the dark, where Unity starts to have like the planet fall apart. And then basically she ends up realizing that Rick is actually a bad influence on her. And she ends up leaving him this love letter and leaving. She like literally packs up her whole species and bounces on Rick, leaving him alone there on the planet. And, you know, he wakes up to find her gone. And she basically kind of leaves it, ending up telling him that he's not good for her and that if she wants to become a full-fledged hive mind, she has to, you know, kind of get her life together. And she kind of bounces. And so Rick takes this really hard. And there's a scene at the end of that episode where he kind of sits down in his garage and he attempts to laser himself to death, but then he's so intoxicated that he passes out and his head falls into the laser, and it misses him, and that's the only reason he doesn't get vaporized. So it's like really dark episode. We can also see in season 1, in the Me Seeks and Destroy episode with King Jellybean, the dark contrasting the light, where Morty and Rick are kind of going on this adventure, and there's a lot of like kind of funny zany shenanigans, but then there's this dark scene where King Jellybean tries to force himself on Morty in the bathroom. Morty ends up having to beat him to death with basically a toilet seat just to basically protect himself from this predator. He doesn't beat him to death, obviously, because Rick has to shoot him later, but he beats him to unconsciousness. And so we see these moments all throughout Rick and Morty where they are set up by funniness. There's like fun lightheartedness, and then there's some like times of actually like intense sci-fi combat that is actually kind of serious, but there's a lot of goofiness. And then they will just drop off into these dark, gritty, horrible moments that just make your jaw drop. And you think, oh my God, what did I just watch? And to me, this is actually a very crucial literary tool. I use this in my games a lot. I love to set up darkness with wholesomeness, fun, kind of goofiness, light, and then we contrast into the dark. This is a great way to like create contrast in games that's jarring, that creates a lot of emotional impact for players. And Rick and Morty does this exceptionally well. And so as GMs, we can take basically a note from the creators of the show with this. It's like, yeah, contrast the fun, the comedy, the wholesomeness, the goofiness with dark grittiness to provide that contrast. Really hit the narrative. Give your players' jaws agape when you drop the heavy stuff on them. And especially if you don't try to do it all the time, it lands with a lot more gravity. And once again, that comes back around to maybe what might be one of the most magical elements of Rick and Morty overall, is that Rick and Morty doesn't really force feed you anything. It gives you a steady diet of like basically like intellectual sci-fi goofiness, and then it trickles all of these other things through there. You get them before you even realize they're happening, and before you know it, you're hooked. Okay, maybe it's a drug. Maybe Rick and Morty is a drug. If so, I'm definitely high-key addicted. Help me. Anyway, so that's where we're at with that. And that, my friends, is going to be a wrap. Thank you so much for coming back to another episode of GM Philosophy in the Morning. At this point, I am here a couple times a week creating content about the best game in the world, D&D. I've recently sort of changed my uploading routine. I'm trying to create more immersive, in-depth content fewer times per week. And so I'm no longer uploading every single day. With that being said, I am still here creating and uploading videos as fast as I make them. So make sure to hit that subscribe button, hit that thumbs up button. And thank you so much for coming by. I really appreciate every single person who's watched the video. And if you're still here at this point, you are awesome. And I really appreciate you. And with that being said, that's going to conclude the video. Thank you so much for stopping by. I will see you awesome people on the next one.